In this video, we are going to look at how to handle AWS SDK dependency injections when building multi-tenant applications. In a multi-tenant setup, you might have to talk to resources that are across different accounts, different regions, etc., depending on the tenant that is making the request. We will walk through a simple example where we have two DynamoDB tables in two different regions in our Amazon account. Now we need to get the data from either of these tables based on the condition in your HTTP request, which means it will be dynamic. The same approach will work if you have to talk across multiple AWS accounts or any other resources. Hello everyone, welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Rahul and I make videos on .NET, Cloud and DevOps. This video is part of my .NET on AWS series, and thanks to AWS for sponsoring this. Here I have a simple ASP.NET API application where I have registered the DynamoDB client and the DynamoDB context into my dependency injection containers. Now I'm using the add AWS service, which is the default mechanism that AWS SDK provides to register dependency injection clients. Now I am injecting the DynamoDB context into my controller method, and I'm using that to read the data from the database. Now in this specific case, if I was to run this application, I can make a request to this, and this will hit the application based on the configuration that is on my local system. Now in this specific case, if I open the toolkit, you can see this is configured using a default credentials with looks at AP Southeast 2, which means this will also be hitting the database from AP Southeast 2. So if I navigate to my AWS console, I have a table movie inside the region AP Southeast 2, which is Asia Pacific Sydney. So if you expand this, you can see the region name here. So if I come back to our application, if we navigate into the .http file, which allows you to make a GET request, and let's make a request from here. Now this is going to hit the endpoint and it is going to return the data from this database. So you can see for 2019, we have these movies coming back. Now if you're completely new to HTTP file, I highly recommend checking out the video on this channel to learn more about it. Now, what if I want to switch the region of this database? Now, I also have another database. So if I switch over to Mumbai, which is AP South 1, I have another database which is exactly movie, and it also has a list of movies in there. Now, what if based on the request parameter, I need to switch between these two regions? Now, let's assume we have a header that is coming inside this request. So let's specify that as region endpoint. And let's say we have the header in here, and based on this, we need to talk to different regions. Now in this current setup, if we go to the program.cs, we can see the registration is happening at the start and it is defaultly tied to the AP Southeast 2, because of which you cannot switch this to a different region once you are inside the context of the map get. Now what you can do is manually create a client inside your map get method. So an example of that would look like this, which is a completely new endpoint that I've created just for demonstration purposes. So I have a new endpoint, which is movie by header region. And all this says is it looks at the context, it gets the header values and gets out the region endpoint, and it creates a region using that endpoint. Now, once we have the region, we can explicitly create the DynamoDB client, pass in the region, and then use that to talk to it. Now, if we want to test this method, we can come back to our HTTP. Let's copy this. Let's paste it in here, and let's put the endpoint, which is going to be /by_header region. So let's copy this as well and paste this in here. Now we are hitting this endpoint and passing the region endpoint. Now let's restart the application so that it builds and reloads the API. Let's make sure to put a breakpoint in here, and let's also go back to the HTTP and invoke this. Now we are passing the region endpoint. So if we do step over this, we have the region header, which is going to be AP Southeast 2. It is manually creating the client. It is hitting the database and returning the data. So you can see it is still returning all the data from that database. Now, if you switch over to HTTP and if we specify AP South 1, let's verify that is the correct region. So in Mumbai is AP South 1. So let's make a request to that database. Now, if you continue requesting, you can see this has a different set of movies. Now we have successfully connected to two different regions. However, this code is a little bit messy. Imagine if you are talking to multiple AWS resources, you'll have to wire this up in each of your controller endpoint, and this can soon become very tedious to manage. Let's see how we can move this into the ASP.NET request pipeline. So let's leave that method in here and let's work with the /movie endpoint. Now, before I walk further into this solution is heavily driven by this blog article by Philip, who has written it in the AWS blog. Now, there's also been different PR contributions to make this work based on some of the issues that you can follow here in GitHub with links inside this article. You can see this started off as an issue inside the AWS SDK, which was then full-blown into this PR, and then we now have this ability which is described in this blog post. So let's walk through the setup and see this in action. So if we switch back to our application code, let's see how we can get this to work. Now, one of the capabilities that we want is to dynamically switch the region or even the AWS options. So for this, we can use the builder.services and use the add default AWS option. Now, instead of hard coding an options here, you can also specify a function that provides an AWS options. Now, this makes it possible for us to dynamically inject it based on the request context. So let's pass in a function for this specific thing. Now, rather than hard coding a function directly here, we're going to introduce a new interface which will provide that func. So let's create a new class in here. Let's call this as AWS Options Factory. Let's also add an interface. So in this case, let's specify AWS Options Factory. Now, the only thing that we need here is to have a function that returns an AWS options. So let's simply give that and pass in a function, and let's specify this as the AWS Options Builder. This is going to create the builder. So we just need a property that returns a func, which is the builder. So let's create that. Now, in this case, let's make sure to implement this AWS Options Factory. And we can simply copy this and implement this property. And let's make this as public. Now, we just need to set up this AWS Options Builder func inside our request middleware. But before that, let's first go and register this Options Factory. So in the function overload, you can get the service provider and you can resolve the functions factory. So you can say get service and you can pass in the AWS Options Factory, which we just injected, and we can invoke this options builder function. So in this case, this is going to be AWS Options Builder, and let's simply invoke this function in here. Now here, let's make sure that this is a public interface, so that this is an interface that is getting implemented. So we have this set up. Now let's make sure to dependency inject this into our container. So let's go back to our program.cs. First, we need to dependency inject the class itself. So let's go to services. And in this case, since we want it to be specific to each request, we will have to register this as a scoped instance. So let's use the add scoped method and let's pass the AWS Options Factory and then also specify the AWS Options Factory class. Now this is going to inject a scoped instance, which means it will be specific for each request, and we'll get a new instance of the AWS Options Factory. Now in the add default AWS options, we can get the service provider and then use that to resolve the method. So we can say get service and you can pass in the AWS Options Factory. And once you have the instance, you can pass in the AWS Options Builder and invoke that function. Now this is going to return you a func of default options. So we have now dynamically set up the AWS options to use this AWS Options Builder, which will be a new instance for each request because this is scoped. Now, the next thing we need to do is to set up this AWS Options Builder based on the HTTP request. Now, this is best done using an ASP.NET middleware. If you're completely new to middleware, check out my video linked here and also in the descriptions below. Now, let's create a new middleware to wire up this AWS Options Factory. So let's create a new class. Let's call this as AWS Options Middleware. Now, inside this middleware, let's take in a request delegate. In this case, let's pass this the next, which is how you can define a new middleware. And let's also specify the method, which is going to be an async task invoke async method, which is how the middleware format is. Now we can get an HTTP context. And in this case, we also want to inject in an AWS Options Factory, which is going to be a new instance for each of this middleware instance because it is a scoped instance. So inside here, let's make sure to configure this AWS Options Factory. So let's specify the options builder, which is going to be a simple function. So let's define that function and let's return a new AWS options. So we can create var AWS options and create a new AWS options class inside inside this. Now, once we have the options, we can return that back. Let's also go back and return the AWS options. And now let's go and configure this. Now, inside here, we need to be able to read from the context. We need to get the region. So GitHub Copilot is already showing us the code for that. So let's simply use that. And in this case, we are trying to get the region based on the header value region endpoint, which it has already detected that I've used in the program.cs, because of which it is suggesting it here. Now we are converting that region using the method and setting the region. If not, we are setting the default region. Now in this case, we can set this to whatever default region we want. Let's set it to Southeast 2 because that is my default region. You can also completely skip this because the default region will be automatically set based on your profile. So all we're doing here is getting the request and setting the region on the AWS options. So let's put a breakpoint here. When this runs, we can know that it is running. And let's come back to our program.cs and let's make sure to register the middleware. Now for that, we need to specify the app.useMiddleware class and let's specify the middleware. So in this case, the name of this is AWS Options Middleware. So let's specify that, which is going to register this middleware into our application pipeline. So this middleware is going to run before the dependency injection resolves a new instance for this map get. Now, one last thing we need to change is that the DynamoDB context and the DynamoDB client is currently registered as singleton services. So you can see the add AWS service defaults to the service lifetime of singleton. Now, in this case, if it is a singleton, it will only have one instance, which means it will get the region of the first region that it is running. Now, in this case, we have to switch back again this to be scoped, which means we'll be creating a new client for each of the request calls. Now, this is something you have to keep in mind that we will be creating new instances and if it has any effects as your application grows in scale. So you'll need to make sure you're testing this when you're using on high load applications. So here we can specify the service lifetime by using the lifetime and let's again use scoped in this specific case. And instead of singleton, we will be using add scoped overload, which will make sure that this is getting registered as a scoped instance as well. Now we have registered all of this. So let's put a breakpoint in here and let's run this application. Now I don't have any specific overload inside my controller method. All I'm doing is just injecting in a DynamoDB context. So let's stop this and run this again. So let's go back to our HTTP file. We have the region AP Southeast 2. Let's run this. And this hits the AWS options middleware. It sets up the options builder and it returns back a 200 OK. Now this is because in this request middleware, we didn't continue the execution after this middleware is being hit. So because of which we need to stop this and we need to make sure that we continue this execution. So for that, we need to call the next delegate or the next middleware that is in chain. So let's make sure to come back here and let's call the await next and pass in the context so that this chain continues. Now, before we run this, we also need to make sure that in the program.cs that when we are registering the add default AWS options, that this also needs to be registered as a scoped instance. Now, currently by default, this is getting registered as a singleton. So if I pass in the extra parameter, you can pass in that this is going to be a scoped instance as well, because we need a different instance for each of the execution. So all of our instances in this case are scoped. So you can see this is a scoped instance of the options factory. The default options is registered as a scope. And we also have the DynamoDB instances registered as a scope lifetime. So now once all of this is set up, let's make sure to run this application. Let's go to the HTTP file and let's make a request on this get endpoint. Now this is hitting the AWS options middleware and it is setting the options builder in this case. So you can see a default options factory is passed in, which has the builder as null, and we are explicitly setting the builder func. Now that is going to return AWS options when it is being requested to. So now the request pipeline is hitting and it's creating a new options. It's getting the request header and it sees that the header has a region endpoint and it is setting the appropriate parameter. Now it set the region. Once that is there, we get the DynamoDB context, which has the region set. So now this is going to make a call and it's going to return the movies. Now this is coming from the region Southeast 1. So let's switch back. Let's remove all the breakpoints. Let's switch this to AP South 1. So let's change this and pass in South 1 and make a request again. Now in this case, it is going to return the data from the other instance. So you can see we can easily switch between these two regions and make calls to the different endpoints based on an attribute on the HTTP request. Now, you can update on the AWS options middleware. You can set up different properties inside here. So the AWS options also has the credentials, which can even connect to different Amazon accounts. You can also configure all the other options that you can set up on the AWS option, set up a profile, etc., and have it behave the way you want in the multi-tenant application. Now, make sure not to hardcode any of the credentials in your application code and to fetch this from a configuration file or from an external secrets manager. So with this simple middleware and the function for the AWS Options Factory, we are able to remove all the other hard coding that we would have had to done inside our controller methods. Now, if you want to talk to a different Amazon S3 or an SQS, SNS, etc., you can use the exact same approach and register it as a scoped instance. Now, the only downside of this is that each of these instances is getting registered as a scoped instance, which means there is a slight overhead of a new instance being created every time. But this is kind of unavoidable if you have to handle for different regions. We could further optimize it by using a pool of region clients and then recycling the instance. If you want to see how that is done, please let me know in the comments below and I'll see if I can do a video on that. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you want to be notified of future such videos, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.